First, I just want to say thank you very much for having me here and for everyone for coming. I very much appreciated the first talk, the opening session. Unfortunately, you are not going to be bursting into applause from me, I don't think, at any point. So my task, as I understand it, is to talk to you a bit about what we think we know from the economics literature. And in particular, my focus is going to be on things having to do with the adaptation of immigrants, and here primarily non-refugee immigrants into host economies. So let me just sort of launch in. So this, I'm going to start with a figure. This first figure is from a paper by Feng Hu and Garnet Pico, who've done an amazing amount of high quality work for Canada. This is for Canada. This is tax data. The top solid line is average real earnings for, think of it as primarily native born. The bottom dashed line is the earnings in the first year after entry for immigrants. And the dotted line in between is actually the same, but for people who are assessed under Canada's point system. And what you can see is that if you go back to about 1981, in particular the immigrants who were assessed under the point system had earnings at entry that were very close to the average earnings in the Canadian, the rest of the Canadian workforce. Then that declined pretty rapidly over the 90s. It's had some sort of relative gains, slight relative gains in some of the boom times in the economy, but by the time you get to the end, even the people who are assessed under this under the point system, their earnings are such that the native-born earnings are about 40% higher than theirs. If you look at all immigrants taken together, it's more like 70% higher than theirs. If we go forward and look at the same figure for women, so that last figure was for men, their experience in the 80s wasn't as bad, but then after that they've fallen behind in relative terms, so that at the end the ratios are pretty similar. So obviously when you look at figures like this is something that raises considerable concern. It raises concern, I think, first and foremost for the immigrants themselves, right? I mean, these are people who are part of our society, and this suggests probably, among other things, incredible frustration coming in here with skills and finding that you're not working or earning at the level you might well expect, given that that's the level that you're seeing from comparator people. It also potentially speaks to some of what we've already heard about, which is sort of the macro impacts, the potential in particular that there is real economic potential, human capital being left on the table, and that if we could figure out a way to implement it, then we could increase economic growth, increase benefits for everybody. So the question is really why? Why have these entry earnings declined so much? There's really, I think, from a series of studies, this is in the Canadian context, almost all of this is in the Canadian context. There are two driving forces. One is the shift in the source country composition. So around 1981, the inflow was heavily Northern European, English, French speaking. In the subsequent decades, the composition shifted dramatically towards countries that did not have English and French as their first language and did not have educational and labor market institutions that were so similar to Canada. That accounts for about half. So just in a strict composition sense, that accounts for about half of that decline. The other half actually looks remarkably like declines that were happening for all labor market entrants through this period. So new graduates from university were facing these same kinds of declines over time. That's obviously a sort of a policy issue for a different set of policies than the ones here. So let's focus in on the first set. So why then do we see that essentially immigrants from non-European countries earn less in Canada? I think there's three possible reasons. One is that the skills that they've acquired in the source country are actually not fully productive in the Canadian economy. So the point would be that a university degree from other source countries is, so non-Northern European source countries, is not equivalent. It is not as productive. The second, now by the way, that's what the point system is meant to try to address, but in fact it takes sort of a BA as a BA as a BA. So The second is that, in fact, they are equally productive, but employers have difficulty seeing that and essentially discount human capital obtained in other places. That's the policy response. There is a policy response that has to do with credentials recognition, and I know that there were sessions yesterday at this conference looking exactly at policy tools that are targeted at that. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The third is discrimination. That is, the productivity of the immigrants is actually equal. Everything's the same in terms of the human capital that they have, but employers discount it purely because it's a person with a different ethnicity. So let me sort of go through what the literature suggests about this, this question about is the human capital coming from other source countries as productive, in this case in the Canadian economy. The place that shows up most directly is that returns to a BA or to a university education from other countries, non-Northern European countries, gets a lower return than BAs from, say, Canada or the US or Northern European countries. So it means the people with BAs in particular earn less relative to, say, the people with a high school education. The question is why? Is that because the foreign education is less productive or just not being recognized? I have a paper with Anna Ferrar and Craig Riddell where we look at this using International Adult Literacy Survey data. In that data, there is a measure of what is essentially cognitive ability. In that data, you again see this result that the return to say, Northern European education is lower than, say, returns to Canadian education. But once one controls for cognitive ability, that difference goes away. Now that's important because what it means is that if these two sources of education were generating the same cognitive outcomes, okay, the sort of same productivity if you want, then it should still be the case that we see a difference depending on where you come from if the only problem is credentials recognition. If, however, the problem is really that you're getting different valued human capital in the two places, from the two places, then you see this result. The implication is that, in fact, the foreign degrees are not as productive in the Canadian economy. It's not a question of credentials recognition. Now, let me go and say, just to qualify that, there's really quite a nice study, recent study using rich German data that finds that credential recognition actually does raise earnings, but it raises it on the order of, say, 15 to 20%. Remember, the gap we're trying to fill is more like 70 or 80%. So there may be something here, but it is not, essentially, my reading of the literature is this is not a silver bullet. Let me actually not go into this stuff at the moment. The second is, sorry, there's too much here. So let me move on to the question of discrimination as one of the other drivers of where this difference is coming from. There's a really nice study by Phil Oriopoulos from University of Toronto where they did what's called an audit study. They sent out resumes that were to employers to see whether they got responses, whether people were willing to interview the sort of fake employees. And they made the resumes identical but changed the names at the top. And what they found was that if the name at the top was not a sort of Northern European or English sounding or French sounding name, the probability of callback was about 30% less. Okay, so that is like, this is sort of the economic definition of discrimination. These people look exactly identical in productive terms on paper. The only thing that's different is essentially a label at the top of the page, and that actually caused a difference. So in the end, my argument would be that these differences are coming partly because the foreign acquired human capital is not as productive here, and partly because of discrimination. So let me just say, as a sort of a side point, I think it's important to think about what human capital productivity means. We think about it directly in terms of the immigrants, in terms of does it generate, can they use it to generate their own income? Can they use it to get higher earnings for themselves? But human capital is also productive in that human capital begets human capital. People with more skills tend to get more training and tend to get more out of training. So the other way to think about this is even if this human capital is not necessarily directly transferable into the Canadian economy, it can be used to produce more human capital. The only thing is we know from the training literature that you can't underspend if you want those kinds of results. In other words, you need to be thinking about something bigger on the lines not just of credential recognition or some amount of language training, but a policy that would be, say, on the order of subsidizing people to go to university for like 2 years in order to generate the human capital, to essentially transfer the human capital they already have, because these are smart people, they have done training, it's just that human capital is not the right human capital for the Canadian economy. To get it to the point to be the right human capital for the host economy, you need to be willing to invest a lot. The payoff will be substantial, but the investment has to be substantial too. And the other thing to think about is that human capital begets human capital across generations. The way I think you want to think about an immigrant is not just as the immigrant themselves, but as a dynasty. You're bringing in that person and the subsequent generations, and that human capital will translate into higher human capital outcomes for the people who follow. The other part of which I'm really not going to make most of this stuff, but the other part I want to talk about, and I'm just going to sort of talk about this quickly, is there's a big part of the immigrant experience that is not given as much weight as one might think it should be, which is the movement of immigrants into firm creation, into being firm owners. So in work with Garnet Pico and Yuri Ostrovsky and Hujulu from Statistics Canada, we've been using data that matches worker and firm tax data with the immigrant landing records for Canada. What you find in that data is that by about 10 years after arrival, fully 40% of immigrants have owned a firm at some point. So it is a huge part of the immigrant experience. It's potentially then part of like, okay, immigrants create jobs, right? That's part of the hope. But let me say, I have actually quite a different reading of the existing literature than Professor Boutin and Professor Constant. My reading is that, at least from the labor economics side, the impact of immigration is more neutral in my mind than what was presented. The sort of seminal paper in this is this paper by David Card, which is a paper about the Mariel boat lift. So in, I think it was 1980, Castro said, you can leave if you want to leave. There's no boats or anything, but you can leave if you want to leave. People got on anything they could get on, set off across towards Miami, and a flotilla came out from Miami and picked them up, brought them to Miami. Within 5 months, the population of Miami increased by 7%. That's the equivalent of a decade worth of Canadian immigration happening within less than half a year. So the question was then, okay, what did that do? Okay, what did that do to the Miami economy? And the answer is, if you look about, its initial impact was decline in wages, but if you look about 4 or 5 years out, there was no impact on wages. Wages came back to where they were. They did not go up, okay, but they were back to where they were. And then the other interesting one is the employment rate, okay? The employment rate, which is just the number of people employed divided by the population. The employment rate also came back to where it was. Now, what does that mean? What that means is a few interesting things. One is, you know, they brought in this huge number of people, and effectively they created a job for every one of them, okay? Notice, though, they didn't create more jobs than the number of people who were there, okay? So if the employment rate had gone above what it was before, then you would get these results that say, oh, immigrants actually, through these complementarities, et cetera, generate more jobs than there are immigrants, okay? If you saw a ratio less than 1, if the employment rate went down, then you would come to the conclusion that immigrants were stealing jobs. The answer is, in fact, that it comes in right at 1. And we've been doing the same thing with this same Canadian tax data. And again, you find a coefficient that is solidly 1. In other words, what happens, somewhat surprisingly, is in pretty short order, you bring immigrants into an economy like Canada's, and new jobs are created, right? New jobs are created enough to make sure that those people have jobs, but not enough to create extra jobs for other people, not enough for job stealing. In other words, immigration has a pretty neutral, okay, a pretty neutral impact on the economy. I think it's important to think about exactly where the source of variation comes from here, because it's always possible to see a positive correlation because immigrants tend to go to places that are booming. So then you'll see, oh, immigrants are positively correlated with, say, GDP per capita. But when you get sort of methods of looking at it that are sort of like, for example, David Card's method, where you introduce an exogenous shock, then we can get at what the real causal impact is. Let me just say finally, so let's think about the job creation side. So what's really going on? One possibility is that in the inflow, in that Miami boat lift was a whole bunch of entrepreneurs, and they created the jobs. So really what's going on is we're bringing in a bunch of immigrant entrepreneurs when we bring in the inflow. That doesn't seem actually to be the case in the data. What actually happens is the existing firms really expand how much they generate in terms of job creation. On the immigrant side, immigrants are much more likely to be firm owners than native-born, but a big portion of that is self-employment, not ownership of incorporated firms. And self-employment looks a lot like employment of last resort instead of creating an innovative new firm, okay? What you see with self-employment is that it tends to happen after people have had several years of unemployment and low earnings. It happens more likely with people with lower skills. Those firms almost never employ anybody else, okay? So it looks a lot like something that is a problem, possibly, rather than a benefit. On the other side, on the incorporated firm ownership, immigrants are, after about 10 years, get to the same ratio of incorporated firm ownership as the native-born. In other words, they're not, I mean, there are these stories. We all know stories about immigrants who own the big firms. They're not, in the end, more likely to own an incorporated firm than a native-born. That's what's in the data. So the outcome, again, is pretty neutral. It's like, are they creating jobs? Yes. Are these like all kinds of new jobs for everybody? No. The outcome in the long run is employment rates come back to where they were, wages come back to where they were. There is no reason to fear immigration, but immigration is not a panacea for the economy either. That's my reading of the literature. Okay, that's it. Oh, you don't need that.
Thanks very much, David. Really, really interesting presentation. Slightly less positive than what we've heard, but this concept of neutrality, I think is an important one for us to think about. Maybe just 2 points. I'm not sure if they're questions or comments. The data at the outset on entry earnings, I noticed it was 2009. Do you have any sense, where is that trend line going? We saw it fall down for economic immigrants. It popped back up a little bit. I mean, I'm looking at UMIT. I think our data tells us that for principal economic applicants arriving in Canada, that entry-level wage on arrival is going back up towards the trend line it was in earlier times, but interested in your comments on that. And then secondly, I'm not sure if there's a question here, but I'm really struck with this concept of human capital being left on the table. And maybe it's a question for you all. This concept of discrimination where the resume is not being, you're not calling the person back if the name is not, McKinnon, or you are calling back if it's my name, but not a so-called foreign name. I think that's a policy question for all of us to think about, because that concept of human capital being left on the table is not just bad for the economy of the host country, but it's a wrong policy approach for the individual who, as you say, has that cognitive ability to do quite well, thank you very much, if they just got the opportunity. So maybe a couple of minutes on those comments, questions, and then I'll turn to our last speaker.
First, I know a bit about the results. I think UMIT knows more than I do, there's plenty of people here who know a lot more than I do. I think one of the things that, in my understanding, has been happening in Canadian immigration policy is that there has been, both through the sort of shifts in the precise way that the entry system is done in the skilled class, but also from the provincial nominees part, which has grown. There's more emphasis on having a job, on giving more, essentially, moving people who already have some kind of job arrangement to the front of the line. And that, I think as far as we understand, does help with entry earnings and has had a positive impact there. Now, the other interesting point, though, is if you follow those people through, by about 7 years out, is my understanding from the provincial nominee program results, they converge again. So what happens is you get people in at a higher level, but their growth is not quite as high. And so, I think that the entry stuff has done better. My guess is the sort of lifetime earnings part may not be as much better as we might hope. But still, I still think it's a positive. It's definitely a positive development. In terms of the human capital left on the table, so let me go back again. I think you're completely right. The discrimination part says that there's human capital left on the table. I think more importantly, it's just unjust, right? I mean, it's just to bring people in and impose that on them is just obviously wrong. So the policy tool should be for that first and foremost, I think. But part of my message was the part that has to do with discrimination is human capital left on the table. The other part, which is that the human capital created in some other sort of institutions in some parts of the world is not as productive in the Canadian economy, means that that part is not human capital left on the table in a labor market sense, but it's still human capital, and we need to think about how to use it. And so that was the point that I was trying to make, that we should think that if there is sort of human capital from some parts of the world that is not going to be as valued, not for discrimination reasons, but for productivity reasons in the Canadian economy, we should be making a concerted effort to help those people bring that human capital into play.